Okay, hello everybody, welcome to Barry's Book Reviews. This is episode number 18, but actually this is my first video review, so let's just see how it goes. The book that I'm reviewing today is a collection of poems by Ahn Do-Hyun called Seaside. Seaside means sight or gaze in English. Ahn Do-Hyun is a very famous poet here in South Korea. And the translator on this volume is Brother Anthony. So Brother Anthony is, of course, a very famous translator here in South Korea. He's been working for several decades, and he mainly focuses on translating poetry, although he does do short stories and some novels as well. And I think over the last several decades, he's translated something like 40 or 50 volumes of poetry. So remarkable career, and obviously a very talented translator. And he does a fantastic job of translating these poems by Ahn Do-Hyun, and is a beloved poet here in South Korea with a career also spanning several decades at this point. Very successful poet, very popular and beloved by lots of people. He also became famous later in his career for writing a best-selling children's fable, which I'll talk about a little bit in a second, but let's just go over some of his early biographical details, just so we can get a sense of who Ahn is. So Ahn was born in 1961 in Yecheon. Yecheon is in the Gyeongsang province of Korea. He apparently wanted to be a poet, wanted to be a writer from quite a young age. So when he was in school, he joined several writing clubs and societies. He participated in those types of groups. And he also won some sort of writing competitions and writing prizes as a youngster as well, as an adolescent. And then after school, he went to university and he studied Korean literature at Wonkwang University. After he did his undergraduate, he went on to study creative writing at Dangguk University Graduate School. And then after graduate school, he got his first job, his first full-time job, I guess, as a middle school teacher. And so he was working as a middle school teacher for several years. And actually I was lucky enough to interview Ahn a few years ago at a book club event. You can watch that full interview elsewhere on the channel. And in that interview he explains that he had an experience around about this time that changed his life. So he was working as a middle school teacher, and he published his first collection of poetry. This was in 1985, and he was about 24 years old. So 24 is quite young to start your writing career. But then a couple of years after that, he had this sort of big experience, this momentous experience in his life that he says changed his outlook. It shifted his perspective on life, on the world in general. And what happened was he was fired from his job as a middle school teacher. He was sacked because he participated in a series of protests in favor of teachers' unions. So he was agitating in favor and in support of teaching unions, and he was fired. Right? He lost his job. He was sort of thrown out from the middle school. And this following that event, he had several years where his life was in turbulence, and he was financially in quite a difficult situation. And he said it had a profound impact on him. It really changed how he thought about the world and changed his approach to life. But that period in his life was also important because it was during that time that he decided to try and become a full-time writer, to sustain himself through his poetry. And this seems to have turned out very well for Ahn. It was a good decision in retrospect, because he's become a beloved poet, and people in Korea genuinely love lots of his poems and seem to regard him very warmly and favorably. And then later in his career, like I mentioned, he wrote a children's book or a fable. It's often classed as a children's book, but really it's a fable for anybody, I'm sure, can get something from this book. So The Salmon Who Dared to Leap Higher, and it's the story of a salmon, and this salmon that has these sort of life experiences, and it's a fable. It's about living in harmony with nature. It's about living in harmony with yourself, and hugely popular story here in Korea. And then it was translated into several languages and published all over the world. And I believe it sold several million copies. And that happened later in his career. But for most of his career, he's been celebrated for his poems and his poetry. And many of his fans or his followers were surprised in 2012 when he took a hiatus from writing. So he stopped writing, or at least he stopped publishing for several years. And today's collection, Seaside, that I think collects the poems that he wrote when he was coming back after this break. So this collection was published in 2017. So he was away for 5 years, half a decade. It's quite a long time to be away. And it's a fantastic collection. It's a beautiful collection. I'll get into some of the poems more specifically in a second. But Ahn is also quite famous for drawing on a variety of different influences, and when I'm researching, these poets and writers for these book reviews, there's several sort of volumes that I always turn to help me with my background research. And one of those volumes is this fantastic volume published by Minumsa. It was published by Minumsa, but it's created by the Literary Translation Institute of Korea, which is a fantastic organization. They help publish help publish today's collection as well. But this book has sort of biographical information and analysis and critical essays about 100 key Korean poets. And the way they talk about Ahn's career is very interesting. So they talk about in his early poems, at the beginning of his career, his poetry was more politically engaged, and they give the example of one of his first major works, his first works that really brought him to wider attention, which was called John Bong-joon Goes to Seoul. And John Bong-joon was a historical figure. He was alive between 1854 and 1885. He was a revolutionary. He led the Dong-Hak Revolution, and this was a revolution sort of fighting and protesting against corrupt politicians. As these things do, this revolution failed, and he was eventually taken to the capital, to Seoul, and executed for his role in this revolution. And this was one of Ahn's earlier poems. He wrote this poem about this figure, and it shows his sort of more political engagement with the sort of social issues of the day, of his day, by writing about this historical figure. But then, what they go on to write about in this volume about Ahn is that his perspective shifted. So he sort of moved away from writing about sort of democracy and patriotism and the nation state and so on. And instead he starts writing about these sort of common everyday experiences that we have, right? So, having a drink with a friend, or stopping at a restaurant on your way home from work. And these sort of small experiences we could call mundane experiences, but there's experiences which build up the daily life of many people. And the work that they identify as showing this shift is a work called Dear Fox. And they say in that work it sort of shows this transition from writing about sort of democracy into writing about these more everyday experiences. And there's this charming quote from Ahn, and it really is a charming quote, but I sometimes wonder if maybe he's sick of hearing this quote, because it often, whenever people seem to talk about and this quote comes up quite a lot. But it is a charming quote. He says, "I don't have much to say, and I don't think I should say too much by myself." And I think that kind of indicates this sort of shift away from writing about politics to writing about other things, reflecting on the simple pleasures of life. And in later poems, he seems to write about love. The theme of love comes to the forefront, but it's not just romantic love. It could be love for nature, love for the wider world, love for your fellow person, but there seems to be a lot of love in his poems. And certainly that shift from writing about politics to writing about these sort of everyday experiences is something we can see in this collection. Another strong point of this collection, it's part of the K-Poet series by Asia Publishers. And in the K-Poet series, you often have essays sort of contextualizing the work of the writer. And there's a great essay in this volume by a literary critic called Lee Kyung-soo. And Lee Kyung-soo, he writes that Ann's poems show love for nature, for marginalized people and places, the Korean land, and he says that Ann inherited those sort of thematic concerns from the tradition of Minjeong poetry, this sort of wider poetry tradition and movement in Korea, and that Ann was sort of drawing on some of the things that they were interested in. And again, you can certainly see that in this volume. So anyway, so let's get into some of the poems in Shison. So the poems here are frequently very beautiful. So two of the first poems I want to talk about are I Long to Go Toward You and Last Letter. And they're both ruminations on different types of love. Both have several very beautiful lines evoking this sort of sense of deep yearning, yearning for love, yearning for attachment of some kind. But what type of love is Anne evoking in these stories? So in I Long to Go Toward You, it initially seems like this, the unrequited love for a partner, for a lover. But the poem ends by contemplating a much broader or wider version of love, which encompasses the nation and even encompasses the world. And I'll just let me read you a couple of lines from I Long to Go Toward You. So this is from near the conclusion of I Long to Go Toward You. I long to go toward you, bringing a weary, wounded, threadbare life, the new world we must create together, the nation we must establish together. And so this poem finishes in a remarkably different place from where it started. And I love this line, bringing a weary, wounded, threadbare life. For who among us isn't getting a little weary and wounded and a little threadbare? And Last Letter. So Last Letter also reads like a tribute to lost love. And when I was reading it, it seemed to be evoking the death of a loved one, right? Someone who's thinking about this, a lover that they've lost who's died. But perhaps, I'm sure that isn't the only interpretation. But it's full of images that suggest, love between people is a sort of small and fragile thing, and perhaps ultimately meaningless, right, in the face of the world. The world is uncaring and doesn't care about this sort of small flicker of flame of love that sort of burns between two people. So quite pessimistic in some ways. But his work shows, in general, the poems in this collection, Last Letter, I Long to Go Toward You, and many others, you can see this sort of affection and warmth that he has for the natural world, and this idea that we're all connected to each other. We're all connected to each other, and we're all connected to the natural world. And I'll just read some lines that I like from this collection that show some of these images of nature. So the snow that was driving down all night long, the sky opens as though for the first time, one by one leaves keep falling. If I had some ground, I would sow it with morning glories. And so I like some of those lines a lot, and we can see that he's a poet who has this sort of warmth for the natural world. In another poem called Autumn Postcard, he has this same natural imagery, but it's infused with sadness and melancholy. But we also see a sort of subdued passion for life, and again this desire for human connection, this desire for some sort of companionship or touch. He says of the falling leaves that just give me a second. So Autumn Postcard, he says of the falling leaves, they seem to be saying there's plenty to share in life, and I long to share something with you. And again, very simple but very elegant, and I think very beautiful. There's another poem that I think is really, again, just studded with these beautiful lines called Seaside Post Office. And this poem finds Anne, he's standing on the shore, he's listening to the waves rolling in and out, and once again longing for companionship as salt-like stars pour down, which again is a very, it's a great image, and I think you have to commend Brother Anthony as well for sort of capturing the imagery that Anne is using there. And then another of my favorite poems is Waiting for Whales. Let me just find this here. Yes, Waiting for Whales. And I think in this poem he captures a feeling that many of us have of time, of life slipping through our fingers, right? That no matter what we do, time is just slowly slipping away from us, right? Time is all slipping through our fingers. And so he writes, though I knew that what we wait for never comes, I waited. Though I knew that life is a matter of growing weary of waiting, I waited. And this description of life, I know that life is a matter of growing weary of waiting, and I wait nevertheless. I think that's something that many of us can recognize in ourselves. Overall, I think it's a very beautiful collection. I found myself dipping into it several times. I mean, I first read this back in 2017, and I've went back to several of those poems, not just the poems that I've mentioned today. So I highly recommend it. It's called Seaside, Poems by Ahn Do-Hyun, translated by Brother Anthony. But before I wrap up today, I'd just like to mention another thing that I think is very interesting about Ahn. He's picked up a very interesting nickname during his career. Some of his fans call him the briquette poet. The briquette poet. And why do they call him the briquette poet? So even if you haven't read any of Ahn's poems, or you don't think you've read any of Ahn's poems, you might very well have. If you've been to South Korea and you've been to, a samgyeopsal restaurant or a galmegisal restaurant or any grilled meat restaurant where they use the coal or charcoal briquettes, you might have seen Ahn's work printed on the wall somewhere. It's quite common. So he has this very short poem called Briquette, and it's so short I can read the whole thing. It's only 3 short sentences, but it's a fantastic poem, so I'll read it now. This is Briquette. Afraid that I'll turn into a handful of lonely ashes, after having loved with all my body, I have yet to become a briquette for anyone. And I'm sure you'll agree that's a beautiful little poem. Just three lines, but it's very romantic, very profound, it's simple, it's elegant, it's full of yearning and passion, and a beautiful poem. He also has another briquette-related poem. In Korea, I should say it's Yontan, or Sut. Yontan, Sut, is what we call the briquettes, the coal briquettes. And he has another poem about these briquettes. And again, it's just 3 lines. It's called I Ask You, and here it is. A burnt briquette, do not kick it so mindlessly. Have you ever given warmth to anyone? So again, you've got passion and desire and romance, and even self-sacrifice, all in 3 lines, which is really quite remarkable. So two fabulous short poems there from Ahn Do-Hyun, and he really is an excellent poet. His poems are really very moving, very beautiful, and this is a great collection of his work. It's called Seaside, a collection of poems by Ahn Do-Hyun, translated by Brother Anthony, and published by Asiapublishers as part of the K-Poet series. Thank you for watching today's book review. Take care, and I'll see you next time.